Hello and welcome back to Dusting History. I'm going to try something different today. I have this image which is not very high resolution and covered in print screen. And I'm going to see how far I can improve the quality of it without too much intervention. So firstly, in Photoshop, I'm going to attempt to correct it as best I can using simply the neural filters. And you can see the problem here when we zoom in. There's that screen all over it, this repeating pattern, as well as a real lack of resolution. So inside the Neural Filters tab, I'm going to use the Photo Restoration checkbox at the bottom and let it do its thing. As you can see, it's cleaned up the face a fair bit with the Enhance Face slider, and it's tried to do its best to get rid of the screen as well, but it's left a lot of diagonals through the image. Now under the Adjustments tab, there is a halftone artifacts reduction slider. Now using that, it does a much better job of removing the halftone print dots, but it has still left a lot of pretty heavy diagonals through the image. You can see the difference there. It's done a pretty good job, but it's not great. So moving on to Affinity Photo 2, they have an FFT denoiser, which its sole purpose is to get rid of those kind of repeating dots. And with this little dialog open, you see I'm just drawing over all the little star points on that graph, and it's going to take away a lot of the high frequency step repeated print dots. You can see it happening on the image as I get rid of those little artifacts. Being careful not to hit the star in the middle, because the middle of that graph is where all the detail for the image is. This does a great job of getting rid of the print screen, doesn't really help with the actual resolution of the image though. And you can see the difference here when I toggle the effect on and off. I undo it and redo it. Next, in Topaz Photo AI, I try to bring the original image in and just see what it does to the dot screen. And as you can see, it hasn't fared very well at all. It's left these large tire tracks all up and down the image. It's done a great job on her face, but no, the rest of that's unusable. So instead, I'll bring in the image that I cleaned up in Affinity into Topaz and clean that up from there. And as you can see, because that dot screen's gone, it does a much better job of getting rid of the grain and enhancing the resolution of the image. I haven't let it go crazy on the face restoration. Again, I don't think it's its strong suit, but it's done a great job of everything else. What does do a good job on faces is Remini. So taking that image that I just cleaned up in Topaz, I've run that through Remini, and you can see I don't love what it's done to some of the image, but I do love what it's done to the face. It's just brought a crispness and a sharpness to that image. What I don't like is how it's sort of posterized the steering wheel, and you can see it's over sharpened some of that stuff that should have been a little bit more blurry. And while I was here, I thought I'd bring the original FFT filtered image in just to see if it did a better job in Remini, but no, I don't think it's done as good a job filtering out the noise of the background. Lastly, going to palette.fm, I'm going to AI generate a color palette, and you can see that's its base level that it's come up with, and you can select some of these across the top. I like to hit a bunch of my favorites like ambient historic, vintage charm, cinematic shades. They all give you a different result. You can also write in your own text prompt if you want to be more specific. So you'll see here I choose Outdoor Vibes. I like that one the best for the color palette, but ultimately I do go back and download Vintage Charm, I think, as well. So downloading the HD version of this. Here in Photoshop you can see I've got all three images. I'll stack the Remini cleaned up version on top of the Topaz AI version, and then I'll stack the palette.fm version on top of those two. And I'll set that to color because I only want the color information. So that's a pretty decent result given that I haven't had to intervene terribly much at all, and I haven't had to employ any of my vast artistic talent to try and pull it up to spec. And you can see if I just bring the original back over the top and zoom in, and then toggle between what I had and what I ended up with, you can see that it's quite an impressive result. Okay, so now that we've seen how far we can go automatically, I'm going to spend a little time making some of my own adjustments just to bring some polish to the piece. I actually like parts of the Topaz cleanup, as I said earlier, but I really dislike things like that where it's over sharpened elements. And you can see there the steering wheel shaft has gotten a lot of kind of crunchy detail I don't need. I put this little grad on just for a sec, just to say this is where my focus is going to be, on her face. Everything else can sort of fall away a little bit, so I don't need everything to be hyper sharp. So putting a mask on that Remini layer and setting it to black, it hides that whole layer. And then with a white paintbrush, I'm just going to paint through the bits I want. And it's done a pretty good job, not only of her face, but also blurring the background. So I'm just going to go through and paint away some of the grain that the Topaz AI put in that the Remini got rid of, but then avoid areas where Remini over sharpened things like that blurry steering wheel I showed you earlier. I'm trying to get as smooth a result as I can without sacrificing areas of detail. Now this is a sped up little bit where I clean all the dots and spots and dust and scratches off the image. There weren't a ton, but enough that it needed a quick clean. Now I've duplicated the image and I'm just going to Gaussian blur it a bit, because when I zoom in you can see there's artifacts on the background and there's some on her clothing as well that I want to get rid of, and the quickest way to do it is just to paint through to a slightly more blurry version of the image, being careful not to do what I just did then and hit an edge of detail and blur that as well. I'm just going to carefully soften off some areas this way. Now if you remember how low resolution this image was and how spotty it was, it's understandable that the soft focus of the steering wheel up the top there is a little janky. So I'm just going to try and paint a smoother result, a more smoothly out of focus steering wheel. So this picture of Elsie Janis was taken in 1906 when she was starring on the Broadway show The Vanderbilt Cup, and she was 17 at the time. She went on to become an actress of stage and screen, a singer, a songwriter, a screenwriter, and a radio announcer. So basically she was a complete overachiever, because she was also a Hollywood actress, a screenwriter, a production manager, and a composer, and starred in quite a number of films, and also wrote quite a number of songs for other famous actresses. She first took to the stage at age 2 and was a headliner on the vaudeville circuit by the age of 11, performing under the name Little Elise. After that, she was a headliner in both Broadway and over in London, and she performed at the grand opening of the Brown Theatre in Louisville, Kentucky on October the 5th, 1925. So I think that's improved the steering wheel quite a bit. Now the last thing I'll do, because I have been hand painting and smudging and blurring, is add a small noise to the whole image, and what that does is sort of unifies the picture, makes it feel like it's all from the one image and not manipulated, as horribly as that has been by me, and I think it sort of makes it look that little bit more photographic. That's quite a change from those pixels to that eyeball. Now turning our attention back to the colour. In hindsight, when I look back at this after a while, I felt it was all looking a bit cold. So I went back to palette and I made another couple of selections, one of which I think was Vintage Charm. And I like that kind of coppery brass looking handlebar. I also like some of the warmer tones of her clothes. I did, however, find a picture of a forest online. I blurred it and I've set that as a colour layer. And using Photoshop's Select Subject tool, I've selected her and masked that green behind her with that selection. Now what I like about her clothes is that sort of two-tone. There's this kind of cooler shade of white on the lit side and a slightly more warm tone, a little bit more ochre tone in the shadow side. So anywhere where the clothing's kind of bright, I'm painting that sort of slightly more blue-grey colour, and anywhere where it falls into shadow, I'm going to paint the warmer colour. Now you can see when I selected subject to grab her, it made a nice selection around her arm, so it put some forest colours over the car interior there. So I'll just go back into that mask and remove that little mask at that spot. I'm also going to go back to the palette I had earlier, the cooler one, and restore these parts of the seat back from that, because it had more of a steely blue look, and I quite like that contrast between the warm leather and that steely blue-grey kind of colour. And you'll see I'll also go up and make parts of the steering wheel less coppery by rubbing back through to that cooler palette. Some of it was quite iridescent blue, so I sort of had to knock some of that back as well, like there's a bit. You'll see I'll select some less blue areas, sort of more grayer tones, and paint those in. So that gives it a little bit of colour fidelity. You've got some cooler tones, some steel, some warm tones of wood and copper and brass. Also, I was aware, but just hadn't got to it, that she was wearing gloves and she didn't have funky looking fingers. Again, trying to modulate those cooler and warmer tones even on the whites of her gloves. Alright, we're getting close. I think she's got a little bit too much of the similar tone on the middle of her glasses there, her goggles. I'm just going to make those a slightly more tan colour, just to differentiate them from her skin tone. And then knock out some of the colours on the inside of the glasses where I think they've got a little bit red. As well as that, a quick correction on her teeth, which copped a fair bit of pink from her mouth, and also try and get that little bit of pink back into her tongue. And after a few more little spot checks here and there, like fixing up her hat in certain areas, I called it a day. So there you go, quite amazing how far you can bring a low resolution image these days. I hope you enjoyed that and found it somewhat useful. I had a really good time. I enjoyed myself a lot on this one. Thanks for joining me. I'll see you next time.